Hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. Today, I'm going to cover Chapter 12, Family. Let's go in and get started. So I'll try to keep this a little short, but essentially what I want to do is just kind of go over what families are and what they aren't. It's kind of the misconceptions about what families should be and what they have been and what they possibly could be, right? Is kind of the idea. And like most things, socially, right, it's a fluid concept, right? Nothing set in stone as far as what a family is or isn't. Describe how the sociological perspective can explain social problems that we see related to the families. Identify common family problems and discuss the ways they affect society. We'll touch on some of those, and the book goes into a lot more detail, but for purposes of the lecture, I'll try to keep it brief. And then discuss the social and political efforts to protect families and children, right? So kind of that perspective as well, right? So before we delve into the social problems and social issues surrounding families, what we need to do is kind of discuss what families are, right? To kind of define the terms, right? So what is a family? So based on the text, a family is a social institution that unites individuals in cooperative groups that care for one another, including any children, right? So this is a very general, very broad definition of what family is. And it's intended to be. My idea of family may differ from yours. Okay. Here in the United States, and not just United States, right? In a lot of Western countries, right? We'll just say in the West, the family model tends to be very nuclear. And here in the United States, we have a very specific type of family model. The kind of traditional nuclear family model, right, is something that we've grown up with, right? If you think about like the 1950s and 60s, right? Like the Wonder Years, and kind of those nostalgic type of family models, right? Like when we think about like the 1950s, as far as being like the pinnacle of the family, right, here in the United States. So that's something that we kind of use as maybe a measure for what a family should be. Okay, but the idea is a family is essentially a group of people that cooperate and care for one another. That's just basic, right? And there can be different variations of very different models of the individuals involved, who they care for, how they care for them, right? The idea is like, if I decided to be with somebody, right? Me and another person, and not get married, not do any of those things, right? Not have children, none of it, just me and this one other person, and this kind of, we'll say a monogamous relationship, right? I partner up with somebody and we don't get married and we stay together until one of us passes away, right? Is that a family? Is that my family? That one person that I've chosen? I'd argue that it would be, right? You couldn't argue that just because we're not married, we're not a family. Just because we don't have children, we're not a family, right? So family models do vary. Family is individuals, at least two, right, that cooperate together. Kinship, so kinship refers to a social bond based on a common ancestry, marriage, adoption, and that joins people into families, right? So I can marry into your family, right? So the kinship networks, that's what this was referring to, right? So there's other ways, right, like families of affinity, which we'll kind of talk about in a little bit, but this is the idea, right? We build families in this way. Okay, and then we have this nuclear family model, which is kind of what I already talked about, right? One or two parents and their children, right? I don't know what that one or two part is. It'd be two people, right? Mom, dad. The traditional nuclear family model would be mom, dad, and two children, right? The whole 2.5 children idea, right? Preferably a son first and then a daughter, is usually how it's depicted, right? If you look at, images from the 1950s and 60s of, the traditional family model, the nuclear family model, it's not, two sons or two daughters. It's one son, one daughter, a dog probably in the picture somewhere, no cats, right? I guess they don't like cats in the 1950s. And white picket fence, traditional like single family home, right? Is what this ideal is. And then we have this idea of extended family. Extended family for sure is also family, not in the nuclear family model, right? The nuclear family model, if you look at those pictures, it's not going to be like mom, dad coming home from work, right? Mom, the homemaker, dad's the breadwinner, kids playing in the yard, and then the grandparents, playing with the kids, and then a couple of cousins or aunts, right? Like that's not the family model that most people would aspire to, right? That's not the traditional North American family model. This kind of multi-generational family or extended family living under one roof, right? For us, it's you get married, well you fall in love, you get married, and then you and your spouse become a new family, right? That's the idea, right? And your whatever relatives you had before, that's extended, right? The priority is you're now your new family is the idea. Okay. And then it kind of leads us to this whole idea of marriage, right? So what is marriage? Well, marriage is a social contract. Marriage is a social construction, right? We could argue that we're not genetically predispositioned or like hardwired to get married. Couple for sure, right? We survive this way. Us as a species, right? This is the way we've always survived. We humans aren't lone wolves, never have been, never will be. It's just not it's not how things are done. I mean, when we were hunters and gatherers, there was no way that we would have been able to survive if it was by ourselves, right? We need the group, the strength, our survival's contingent, I guess, on our ability to maintain successful kinship networks, right? So in an attempt to kind of strengthen and reinforce those networks, we have the institution of marriage, right? So let's maybe think about this way, right? So if you're with somebody, right, a couple of years, right, you and another person, and you decide, you know what, it's not working out anymore. It's not you, it's me. I decide I want to go ahead and do something else, right? You send a little text message, fire that bad boy off, and then in the text message, you say, hey, it's not you, it's me. I need to go find myself, whatever it is you need to do, right? And then you fire off that text message, right? Are you done? Can you be done? Can you end a relationship with a text message? I argue you could, right? It'd be pretty easy. Maybe not the most welcomed way, right? Or a grown-up way, depending, right? Depending on the situation, right? To end something like that. But the idea is you can do it. Now, when you think about a marriage, can I end a marriage with a text message, right? Like I just sent a text message, I'm like, hey, you know what? I don't want to be married anymore. You fire that sucker off, and then, no more marriage. No, it doesn't work that way, right? There's not an app for that, at least in that way. So marriages, what they do is they reinforce this idea that we're going to stay with somebody, right? Like, so if I get married, right, or if we get married, right, the idea is that it's two institutions that we're dealing with now, right? So we're dealing with the government, right? So when you get married, you file paperwork with the states, and now in the eyes of the state, you're a married couple, right? So when you file taxes, now you file taxes jointly, like you're now throwing your lot in with this other person, right? So the state will view you as, one entity, right? One married couple. So that's a state institution, right? And then we have, depending on your background, right? For most people I know, they've gotten married, there's some sort of like religious component to it as well. So you have, my experience, my background, church, right? So you're Catholic, you're getting married. So usually it's the courthouse, get the state handled, right? You're married, and then you go off to a church, and then you get married under the eyes of God. So you got Uncle Sam and you got God, right? And those are two institutions that are going to help support, going to help maintain, ensure that this marriage stays together, right? There's going to be guidelines, there's going to be rules, there's going to be expectations, right? There's going to be sanctioning on both sides, for from both institutions that might make it will make it difficult for you to divorce, right? I mean, marriage fairly cheap, fairly quick to get into, right? Not a particularly expensive thing to do. Divorce, I mean, last time I heard, never been, talking about $500-600, I think, to kind of start the process. So right off the bat, financial burden, right, to get divorced. And then that's if everything goes well, right? That's if both parties, decide that they amicably want to, go ahead and just, call it, and you're civil to one another. Like, it's still process, right? It's still paperwork. It's still time. It's with the intent, right? You could argue by design to make this something that's difficult to move away from, right? And then you have the church as well, depending on what church and how connected you are to the church. They could also make it very difficult as well to get divorced, right? I mean, I've had friends that were Catholic, they were married, and they weren't doing well, and the family knew they weren't doing well. So the family told the church, and the church reached out and offered services, family counseling, right? Which they eventually took, right? And it helped with their marriage, so worked out. But that's the idea, though, right? This married couple was not doing great, and the church reached out to them and said, "Hey, you know what? I heard you guys are not doing good. Maybe thinking about divorcing. Let's go ahead and slow that down for a second. Let's go ahead and come in for counseling and see if we can kind of repair this marriage before you go, down that road," right? So there's I'm not going to say coercion. That's not coercion, but the idea is that there's, I guess, barriers, to just getting divorced, right? It was like, people will be involved, right? Is the idea, right? So in terms of a marriage, there's multiple institutions that two that I just talked about, right, that help reinforce and maintain marriage in the way that we know marriage to be, right? A lawful relationship, usually involving economic cooperation, sexual activity, and childbearing, right? And for most of us, when we think of marriage, those are kind of what we expect from our marriages, right? And the one they didn't have here, and we should probably throw that in there, would be love. So for us here, love is also a biggie, right? I'd argue that none of you would ever consider getting married to somebody that you weren't in love with. If you had a friend that was getting married, or somebody that you knew close to you that was getting married, and you were talking about it, like, they said, "Yeah, it's going to be, I like him a lot. I think it's going to be a good marriage." And you're like, well, I sure hope you'd like them. And they said, "Well, yeah, I mean, I like them enough. I'm not in love with them, but it's a good fit. I think I could be happy. I don't know if I love them, in that way, right? Then, but it should be okay, right?" That's not exactly how you want to start off a marriage, at least for us, right? I don't know if you guys, maybe off, but I'm trying to go, not to deviate too much from lecture, right? But for those of you who have watched that nightmare train wreck of a show, 90 Day Fiance, there was a couple on there, and there was an episode. And if you know the show, then you know, and if you don't, then you don't. But there was an episode, and the couple was one of them. He was from South Africa. I think his name was Sinjin, and his wife she's American. I think her name was Tanya. And there was an episode where they're talking, and Tanya says in an interview, right, because they're interviewing the couple on the show, that she already met the love of her life, that she already met her soulmate. So she's sitting there next to Sinjin, who I think she's married to at this point in the show. She's married to, or about to get married to, because he's over here on a K1 visa, right? And she says, no, I'm going to marry this guy, but the love of my life, my soulmate, that already happened. And he just kind of turns around and looks at her. Right? And could you imagine that though? Imagine, you're sitting down with somebody that you're going to get married to, right? And they say, well, I've already met my soulmate, the love of my life, but I love him too, or I love her too, just not in the same way, not soulmate material. Like, not the not exactly the way you want to start a marriage, right? And it was, a ridiculous show, and I bring it up because it is kind of ridiculous and silly, right? But if you think about it though, right? If you're for us here, when we think about marrying somebody, it's love is a huge component. For some people, it's the only thing that really matters, right? Do you love them or not? And if you don't love somebody, what difference does all the other stuff make, right? If you don't love them, nothing else matters. And that's culturally how we view marriage and relationships here, right? Other countries, very different. Other cultures, very different, right? Other countries or cultures, right? There's arranged marriages, right? Well, the marriage isn't based off of love first. The idea is that you find a good match, and that eventually you will learn to love that person, right? It's the idea that the love comes later, right? Love isn't something that exists initially. I mean, it could, but the idea is that when you are in an arranged marriage, you don't know that person yet in a meaningful, significant way. So the love, you can't really love somebody that you don't have a meaningful, significant relationship with, right? That kind of has to be something that's built over time. So very different ways of viewing that, right? The motives behind getting married. So for us, though, I'd argue that's going to be the whole love part, right? And then the idea of economic cooperation, right? The idea is that we throw our lot in with this other individual, right? Financially, obviously sexual activity. I don't think for most of us, right? I'd argue that we wouldn't imagine or couldn't see ourselves getting married to somebody that we weren't sexually attracted to, right? That we didn't want to have sex with. And then the idea of childbearing, right? Childbearing, for the most part, yes, for people that are married, right? But definitely not a different requirement, right? Like there's definitely plenty of people that are married and very happily, and then children aren't a part of that. I just read a little thing the other day about is it Seth Rogen, the comedian, and his wife, right? They don't plan on having children, right? But that's his wife, they're married, that's their family, that's their immediate family. It's just them two, right? No children. But I'd argue there's definitely economic cooperation. I argue there's sexual activity within the relationship, right? But childbearing is not something that they want, you know. So just kind of a really quick, rundown of what marriages are, right? Now, people have a broader and more inclusive idea of what family means, and I've kind of talked about this already, right? This idea that we have this kind of traditional nuclear family model that kind of always stays with us, but your family can start off as a nuclear family, that traditional nuclear family, and then, like I said, life happens, things change, you get divorced, people, pass away, things like that, things happen, right? And then that nuclear family model is now forever changed. Okay. So, you could be a single parent with a child, family, married couple without children, like we discussed, you're still a family. Child being raised by a same-sex couple, child being raised by grandparents or aunts or uncles, or we can keep going, right? Still family, still a family model. Okay, sociological approach to family problems. The biggest problem or for married couples, the number one issue that they argue about, or is really the biggest problem, is going to be money. Married people argue over money. Okay. So that's kind of a constant for a lot of marriages, as the lack of, or how to spend, or things like that, right? There may be power differentials within a marriage, right? So say it's something along the lines of, if, like, say if I was married and I was the breadwinner, right, I made more money than my spouse. The idea is if I made more money, even though she may work and bring her own money, because I make more money, right? Or the more money I make, kind of the more say I have into how the money is spent is kind of the idea, right? Even though we argue we won't do that, or we won't let that affect how we manage our money as a married couple, right? But the idea is that people report that being a big issue, right? So one, just not having enough money. Two, how the money is spent, right? Who gets to say is a big problem, right? But in terms of social problems, um, not so much focus on individual behavior, right? This is a social class that we're focusing on, larger scale social problems, for the most part, right? We can do very micro, but for the most part, larger scale, right? Concern with families, with how families are shaped by society's standard of living and technology. So we can kind of talk about those. How patterns of family life are linked to income, education, gender, and race. Uh, I could spend 2-3 hours talking about income, education, gender, and race as far as families, right? We don't have that kind of time, but I'll cover some of them, right? I already kind of have as far as income, right? Income is a huge problem for most married couples. Education is also a big one too, but education, they all tie into one another, right? And what I mean by education, right, is the level of education that you have will dictate or could shape a lot of things within a marriage. Even dating, as education's an issue, right? I mean, I guess a question I'll just ask you, right? Just kind of consider as we go through lecture, right? For the people that are listening, right? Um, in terms of dating, do you have issues dating somebody with less education than yourself? You could be dating somebody right now who has less education than yourself, right? And the more time you spend in school, right, in college, the more education you gain, right? So for those of you, you're sending out of college. You guys are all probably looking to transfer somewhere or maybe go to some sort of program. You might be nursing majors, right? You guys got couple different things going on, right? But the idea is you're going to keep moving forward, right? Upward and onward. And then the idea with that is that when you reach your academic goals, right, there's going to be professional goals that you have, right? So the more education you have, the more successful hopefully you'll be in your professional goals, and the more money you'll make. So that's kind of the idea, right? So let's say you're the breadwinner in your family, right? Because of education, right? How does that change your family? How do you choose your family based on education? Would you date somebody that has less education with you? Are there problems in marriages in terms of uh, couples having less education, and in what way, right? Do men have an issue marrying women who have less education than themselves? Historically, no. I'd argue most men wouldn't have an issue marrying a woman with less education than themselves. Um, Research would argue that women do, that a lot of women have issues dating men with less education. So women that are college educated, more often than not, will require or argue that they want to, or essentially for themselves, right? They'll say essentially, I won't date anybody who has less education than me. They have to have at least the same level or higher, right? Why? Why would that be a requirement that we see from men? Why do we see more women requiring that of their partners, right? Where men are okay with marrying women that have less education, where education is not really actually a factor, really, in terms of whether somebody is a suitable partner, right? I'm not going to get into it, right? Maybe that'll be a discussion board post, but it's something for you to kind of think about, right? There is a difference. I'm not making it up. You guys can look that up in terms of preference and spouse as far as education level. In gender and race, we can kind of leave out for now. Just don't have the time for it. All right. So myth of the family. So the nuclear family model, I'm not picking on it. At least I don't think that I am, because it's something that the majority of us want, right? like I said, I don't particularly see myself getting married, but if I did, it would be what? A nuclear family model, right? Me, spouse, potentially some children, right? It is kind of the model that seems to be preferred because, we've been socialized to want this family model. Um, and you can see this picture here is like a perfect example of that nuclear family model. You have dad just came home, family's super excited to see him, kids are just on top of him, right? Mom, now we don't know, right, if she's a homemaker or not, but we can just go ahead and assume that she is. The perfect example of the nuclear family model, right, would be Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, right? So I Love Lucy, right? Very popular show. I'm sure everybody here has seen at least one episode of I Love Lucy, but that's what it was, right? She was the homemaker, right? And Ricky Ricardo was the breadwinner. This is what we're seeing here, right? Look at mom, dad, son, daughter, right? We don't see two sons, we don't see two daughters. It's, son and a daughter, and, perfect, ideal. Okay. Now, the book's going to argue that we're shifting away from this idea or this ideal, right? The nuclear family. But I mean, I'd argue that we are, but I don't see this one going away. And if it does, it's not going to be anytime soon, like not within our lifetimes for sure. Like this one, this nuclear family model, this traditional family model, this is just us. This is like baked into our foundation, right? This is who we are, right? This is our go-to. Like I said, just this is what we strive for, right? It's an ideal. And like I said, a lot of people will strive for this ideal and they'll obtain it for maybe a short period of time. Then, family model changes and they're no longer the nuclear family. But this is what we go to, right? Most of you, we can ask yourselves this question, right? Do you want a nuclear family? Is that like your ideal model, right? And some of you may say no, that you have another model, right? But I'd argue, the vast majority of you in this classroom, when you think of having a family, if you want to have a family, that this is the model that you see yourself pursuing. Okay. And nobody's, for the most part, right? At least here, I'd argue for the most part, we're not thinking our ideal family model is going to be, I'm going to get married, I'm going to move into my wife's parents' house, they're going to build like an addition onto their house and we're going to live in the back, and then we're going to have her kids there, and then we're going to live with because her grandparent. Like nobody's talking about, or ideally moving into a multi-generational family, right? Getting absorbed into that. It happens. A lot of families live this way, function this way, based some out of tradition, some out of necessity, but that's the idea, right? And some families do this because it's a necessity, right? Maybe ideally they would live by themselves, but financially that's just not feasible, right? Orange County is an expensive place to live in, so living with in a multiple generational household is a strategy for living in Orange County. I mean, I've read articles about how some families are using, essentially what they're doing is they're combining incomes, right? So a family will, let's say, maybe rent an apartment, right, initially, and there'll be a lot of people living in one apartment, and they'll save money collectively, right, and then they'll purchase a home, right? So now the family's living in a home, multiple generational family living in a home, grandparents, adult children, and children, maybe cousins, and you get the idea, right? So the family buys a house now, right, and they stay in this house and they save, and what they'll do is they'll take that money and then purchase another home in the area. So now this family collectively owns two houses in an area, and they'll do the same thing, right? Save, and purchase additional property, right? So this is a strategy, right, for essentially generating like generational wealth, right? So some people do this very effectively, right? So one way, right, how we solve social problems using families. So another thing we need to talk about would be the functionalist perspective in terms of family. Pretty straightforward, right? This is the family model, traditional nuclear family model. And because, well, it's functionalism, right? Does it want this to change? Absolutely not. So from a functionalist perspective, the traditional nuclear family model is the ideal. We don't want it to change. We'll do everything that we need to do, that we have to do in order to make sure that this stays the model. That this is what people want. This is essentially kind of like I said before, right? Baked into into the institutions that we live in, right? This is us essentially, right? And when we see this family model start to disintegrate, when we see this family model no longer being the ideal, then it worries, the status quo. It worries the system, right? It could be viewed as disorganization, dysfunction, all these other different types of family models, right? Here in the US, this is what you should want. This is how your family should look, right? You as a breadwinner, potentially, right? Then you have a wife, realistically, right? Your wife's not going to be the homemaker, right? And that's maybe like a status symbol. Like if you can live in Orange County, right? If you can live in Orange County as a breadwinner and your wife is the homemaker, that's a statement in and of itself, right? That I live in Orange County and I can afford to survive here on just one income. So most people it's going to be dual incomes, but still this family model. And this is the idea, right? That the family is essentially what keeps the institutions that we live under, right? That keeps society essentially, right? This is the way they're going to view it. That when this family model disintegrates, society disintegrates along with it, right? If this is no longer what we're striving for, then what's the point, right? It's essentially like a loss, right? Essentially, the world has collapsed, right? And you've seen this, right? And I'm not the only one who's heard this, time and time again, right? This is not a new song, right? A song and dance, right? This is not a new concern, right? The disintegration of this traditional family model. When this model goes, then society goes with it, right? See here, anything else I want to focus on? Well, I mean, they're going to argue as family struggles to adapt to modern society, social problems emerge. And one of the social problems they can argue emerging would be, just like an example, like, teen pregnancy or juvenile delinquency or just deviancy in general, right? When the family starts to disintegrate, then we have all these other social problems or ills that are a direct result of, essentially poor families, right? You know, single mothers get a pretty bad rap, right? We've seen that, and that's not a new one, right? We've seen this that's been around for a long time, right? The idea that single mothers are incapable of raising healthy children, right? Healthy, well-adjusted children. Failing families lead to problems. Now I wouldn't say, because we got to be careful, right? So failing families or failing nuclear families, right? So a family could be, like I said, a bunch of other different things. So we've got to be careful when we say families. We're talking about the nuclear family. So failing nuclear family models leads to a problem within our society, right? But if it's a healthy family, then what difference does it make? Like I said, what if it's mom? Like, what if dad's not in the picture and it's like mom, her dad, and her mom, right? So grandparents helping her raise these kids. Is it a family? It's definitely a family. And is it a healthy, functioning family? It is. She works. Her parents help her take care of the kids. Kids are healthy. Kids are happy. They're fine. All right. Oh, conflict theory. All right. So conflict perspective, right, is that the family in itself, right? Like just like with other institutions, right, where there's the haves and have-nots. This is a dynamic that we see within the family, right? So within the family, we're going to have a have, right? And depending on the family, we'll just say, just go with this, right? We'll say the patriarchal system, right, where the father is the figurehead, right? He has the final say, king of the castle, right? Captain of the ship, kind of thing. And depending on the father, right, it will determine how this goes. But it's the idea that within the system, that the husband's going to have the final say or more control over, familial affairs or family affairs, right? So, like I said, it just depends on the culture and depends how rigid that system is, right? I mean, we could argue that. See, that's even not a great way to look at it. Like you could say, like Western culture, not particularly. It is particularly rigid as far as a patriarchal system, but then again, we have other examples of way more rigid and restrictive patriarchal systems. Like, so it does exist, but at what level and how rigid it is, right? That's kind of what changes, or could change, right? The family structure upholds male social economic domination, right? So that's the idea that the father's a breadwinner, right? When the father's a breadwinner, wherever the breadwinner is, they have more say in, how the money's spent and how the, as far as how the family functions, right? And this is an interesting one too, kind of like we talked about, right? So what happens in a system where men are kind of, expected to be the breadwinners, right? So think about that. Are we seeing this as an issue now with a lot of men not being breadwinners and having to deal with that? Right. I remember it wasn't the last time, but I was getting my hair cut and at a salon my friend works at. And there was a woman next to me, and I'm ear hustling, and so is my friend who's cutting my hair, right? Because we're chatting, but that's what we do. And the woman sitting next to me in the chair was telling the woman cutting her hair that she was in a relationship with a dude, and he was super nice. She really liked him. And he wanted a family. And she was like, great, I want a family. So somebody who wants a family, right? But she said that he wasn't doing anything to make that family kind of, to bring that to fruition, right? So the idea was like he wanted the family, but he wasn't doing anything he needed to do in order to create the family as far as like work. She's like, okay, well, you want a family. Okay, well, how are you going to support that family? Like, how are you going to take care of this family that you want? Like, well, what do you do for work now? Like, how much money do you make? And it may sound harsh, right? To kind of put a dollar amount on a boyfriend, because it ended up being her boyfriend, she said, and they're not the boyfriends anymore. But that's what it was, is that he wanted the family, but he wasn't able to do what? Provide financially. So she left, right? So he wanted this family model where he was what? The breadwinner. And that's what she said. He wanted her. He said that when they had a family, that he wanted her to stay home and take care of the kids. And she's thinking like, I can't stay home and take care of the kids. There's no way you're gonna make enough money for me to be a homemaker. So there's kind of unrealistic expectations as far as what he was going to be able to do as in terms of providing for a family that he wanted, right? He can't. It had to be a dual income household for sure. And she makes more money than him. But he wants her to stay home. Why? How does that make sense? It makes sense because, well, you could argue, right? And we could differ on this, right? But I would say it makes sense because he was socialized to be the breadwinner, right? He grew up thinking, okay, I'm a man, I'm going to be the breadwinner, and this is what it's going to be. My wife is going to be the homemaker, and if she's not home taking care of the kids are going to, not grow up right, whatever right is. So this is the way it's going to be, right? But failing to recognize that that's a family model that he can't maintain. So what will happen? He'll find somebody that he can maintain that family with, right? The girl at the salon, she's already making more money than him. She's out. He'll find somebody that he'll have that family with. And how well do you think that'll go? Right? Sometimes I wish this was an in-person class because we could have a discussion about that right now. It would be a good one. So men maintain positions of power through violence. So this is the uglier, darker side of this, right? This idea that domestic violence does exist, and more often than not, there's alcohol involved, but we won't get into the alcohol and substance abuse, right? We'll just leave it here for now. So physical violence is not to say that I'm trying making excuses for it. There's no way, shape, or form of making excuses for it. But if you got to think about it, right? If there's a family that's struggling financially, right? Most families do struggle. Most marital issues revolve around finances, right? So if finances are scarce, right? If there's not enough money, anger, tension, resentment, things like that could lead to verbal, emotional abuse, and then unfortunately physical abuse too, right? So that's a problem for sure. Family subject to social programs and policies, potentially, right? And then we have this idea of the modern family, right? So this is going to be interactionist or symbolic interactionism, right? So this is going to be essentially the idea that we're redefining the terms, right? We're redefining what family is, right? So show Modern Family, that's the whole point of the show, right? It's redefining what family is. So I've never watched the show, not because I have anything against it, just can't watch everything. But I do like the premise, right? And what it's trying to do. And what it's trying to do is provide another example of what families can be, right? And which is funny because you had Ed O'Neill here, right? Which was the actor in Married with Children, which was a horrible TV show from the 90s. If you've ever seen it, it didn't age well. But give it a go. Like if you've never seen Married with Children, give it a go and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, right? It's from the 90s. We'll just kind of leave it at that, right? But in that show, the family was a patriarchal family, right? He was the head of the family, he was the breadwinner, and then he had this kind of very kind of, I don't want to say stereotypical, but the very stereotypical type, housewife, right? It's a horrible show. And so it's funny that he's now in another show about families, right? A very different family. But the idea between interactionist perspective, right, is the idea we're going to go and redefine the terms, right? Redefine these labels, redefine the roles, right? So the idea is that women now are making more money, right? Women are spending more time in college. Men are opting out of college a lot. I just saw an article about that the other day. Men opting out. So if men are opting out of college and women are spending more time in college, we can argue that we're going to eventually see a shift potentially, right? So these college educations are probably going to translate into maybe more income, right? And maybe women will be the breadwinners, right? And we'll have to see how that changes what families are, right? Where the wife's the breadwinner and the husband's the homemaker, right? And I have friends that are like this, right? I have friends that definitely function this way. Two friends, couples that I know, where the wife is a breadwinner because she has the education, right? One of them works from home part-time and they make more money than their husband that works full-time with their part-time job because they have the education, the master's, right? And the master's goes a long way. The other one, same deal, makes more money than her husband, considerably more money, both of them, than their husbands, right? And their husbands stay home and provide the childcare because it just makes sense, right? And if you know how expensive childcare is, you understand that it's just the amount of money that both of them, the amount of money that they would make would pretty much just go to childcare for the most part. So it's just better for them to stay home and take care of the children, right? Save the money, and who better than to the child's father than take care of it, right? Just makes sense. But the issue with symbolic interactionism and this approach is that it's going to deviate from the norm, right? So this whole conflict will arise when it challenges, institutional norms as far as what men should be doing in terms of family, what women should be doing in terms of family. Like I said, it's redefining those roles, and then the stress and strain is a result of that, right? That change, that shift. Okay. Problems in the family. We've kind of talked a little bit about divorce already, right? Now, depending on who you ask, right, you'll get a different answer, right? But isn't it kind of the fun with sociology, right? There's different answers depending on your background, how you feel, right? Of course, I'm talking about whether you're liberal or conservative, right? It's going to shape the way you view the world. So, divorce, is it a problem? Well, it depends, right? So globally, the United States has the highest rates of divorce. We have the highest rates for a lot of things too. Like we're at the tippy top for a lot of stuff, and it's probably not something that we should be proud of, right? That we have the highest divorce rates in the world. So you're looking at about 50% of marriages ending in divorce. So those are not good odds. Like I said, they're not great. 50-50 Vegas, fantastic odds. 50-50 marriage, not good. So is this a social problem though? That's the question, right? Is it a problem that we have 50% of marriages ending in divorce, or is this a good thing? If it's a problem, why is it a problem? And if it's a good thing, why is it a good thing? So we can kind of go back and forth on that, right? If you're liberal, you could argue that it's a bad thing, right? I'll skip this real quick. If you're liberal, you could argue if you're liberal, you could argue it's a good thing, right? In the sense that, we have freedom to make our choices. If I'm in a marriage that is not healthy, marriage that I'm not happy in, then I should be able to leave that marriage, right? I shouldn't have to worry, or I shouldn't be forced to stay in this marriage. It shouldn't be made, the system shouldn't make it difficult for me to leave a marriage that I'm not happy in, right? Or that it's not safe or unhealthy to be in, right? It's kind of the idea. So particularly not a problem. I'm going to go and say it, right? And we've seen like the whole like divorce party stuff, right? People kind of removing the stigma and shame associated or connected to getting divorced, right? I've never been to a divorce party, but I'm still young enough, I guess, where I might be. Maybe some of you have, right? But the idea is that, we didn't see divorce parties, like this is a fairly new thing, along with gender reveal parties too, right? Like I've been to quite a few of those. Growing up, we didn't have those parties where you went to see what the baby was going to be, but that's a big deal now. Interesting. All right, but liberals tend to favor easy divorce as a means by which women can free themselves from unhappy or abusive relationships, right? So for liberals, divorce shouldn't be a difficult thing, right? If you want to get divorced, go get divorced. You live your truth, you find your happiness, whatever it is you need to do in order to do that, good for you, right? Conservatives, obviously, going to go the other route. Conservatives going to argue that the government, right, and society should make getting divorced more difficult, right? That we should put more effort into maintaining these kind of traditional family models, marriages, right? We don't want people getting divorced because divorce kind of erodes the foundation of our country, essentially, right? And there's other social problems that are, result from that too, right? Children don't do well. They can argue for the health of children to a certain extent, right? We care about the children on this one, and you can argue that two parents, are better than one, right? But I guess it would depend on the parents. So if it's two healthy parents that are, happy being married and happy being parents, then yeah, I would argue that the child would benefit from that, right? But if it's two parents, right, two people that are not happy in the marriage, not happy with each other, a child's going to see that. If there's turmoil, animosity, conflict between the couple, right? Kids see that. Is that healthy for them? So is it better to keep families together even when the families don't function well? Some people will say yes, right? Some people will argue that under no circumstance should you get divorced, right? That the whole point of getting married is the sticking part, right? That the love isn't what happens at the beginning. Love is what happens down the line, right? When things aren't fun anymore in that way, right? Aren't new, tough times and, essentially, trials and tribulations and things like that, right? And you're still able to be with this person, right? That's love, right? So it just depends on, how you define it, how you view it, right? As far as like social problems, right? The idea is that for liberals, right, if it's a social, if it's a problem to stay married with somebody because there's, issues of, domestic violence or emotional abuse or just financial abuse, something along those lines, then obviously, yes, divorce. And for conservatives, we can argue that, maybe we might benefit from, I would say sanctioning, but the idea of, well, it would be a sanction, right? The idea of making sure that the families not outright preventing them from getting divorced, like not saying like you can't legally get divorced, but the idea is that we're gonna make it difficult for you. We're gonna make you jump through a few more hoops, right? It's like the idea with like my friends, right, that were married, they were having issues, and the Catholic Church reached out to them and said, "Hey, we hear that you're having a hard time. well, we'd like you to come in for some counseling. Would you be willing to consider that? Right. That's them stepping in, right? That's institution stepping into your marriage and offering you help, right? And if it's help that you want, then it's welcome. And if it's help that you don't want, then it might be very unwelcome, right? Like if you're made up your mind that you want a divorce, and then you have an institution kind of pressuring you to come in for counseling that you don't want, right? That might not necessarily be a great thing. Okay. Oh God. Okay. Cohabitation. This is an interesting one. I love talking about cohabitation because a lot of people end up cohabitating for many different reasons. Right. We can look at this from a liberal or a conservative perspective too, of course, right? But cohabitation is essentially, I'll define the terms, two individuals who live together that are not married. Pretty simple, right? You cohabitate. I'd argue in terms of a social. So from a liberal perspective, right? This is a fantastic way to handle a lot of social issues, right? So maybe we can look at it from the perspective of finances, right? So living in Southern California is very expensive, right? But if I could go ahead and live with somebody, right? Not a friend, right? Because think about it, right? What's a one bedroom? Like $2,000 a month. So do I want to pay $2,000 a month on my own? Can I pay $2,000 a month on my own for my own apartment? Right? That's getting tight. I'm not saving anything. I'm stretching my budget. I'm essentially living to pay rent. I'm working just to pay rent. But if I find somebody that I like enough, right, we can move in together, right? And we can share that one bedroom, right? And think about it: moving in with somebody that you're romantically involved with in a one bedroom, that could work. Moving into one bedroom with your friend, that's not going to work, right? What are you going to do? You're going to do bunk beds, or you're going to have one bedroom and you take the living room, like, so you effectively, don't have a living room anymore. You get the idea, right? When you're coupled with somebody in that way, it makes this a much easier living arrangement. All right, hopefully. But that's the idea. Now we can combine expenses, right? Instead of me paying 2,000, I only pay 1,000, right? And we have extra money to save, things like that, right? And then also the idea that it could be a trial run for marriage, right? Maybe I'm not really sure if I want to get married or get married to this person. So we'll live together and see if that would work, right? You kind of get to peek behind the curtain, right? To see what things are like when the other person doesn't realize that somebody else is, looking, right? You get to see those things, right? Are they neat? Are they clean? Are they a pig? Or how do they function behind closed doors, right? You get to see that before you actually jump into the marriage part. So this could be a fantastic way to get all those things done, right? So I'd argue liberals are probably, they would be more willing or more accepting of cohabitation, right? And then they have this idea as far as conservatives. I'd argue conservatives are probably might be more inclined not to, right? In a sense that this might erode, that kind of traditional nuclear family model, right? It just depends. I'm not gonna blanket. I'd argue there might be some people that are very liberal, socially, but also could be very, religious too, right? For some, and so for them might be a deal breaker, right? Because to think about it, if you come from a particularly conservative background, and part of that conservative background is religion, right? This would be a problem. So growing up Catholic, so moving in with your boyfriend or girlfriend before marriage, that's sin, right? You're not going to convince your parents that you're not going to have sex with this person that you just moved in with, right? So now you're living with somebody you're not married to, you're having sex with somebody you're not married to, and then the risk of having children with somebody that you're not married to, right? So this whole idea of sex out of marriage, right? Then you have this children being born out of wedlock. These are all sins, right? So morally wrong. And if you grew up in a community where they hold these beliefs, right, then it's a problem. And if you didn't, then it's not a problem. It just depends, right? And there's also the criticisms, right, for cohabitation. And One of the criticisms for cohabitation would be the less stable environment for raising children. And I guess I can give them this to some extent, right? To the critics. Because the idea is if I'm cohabitating with somebody, right, and we have children, if I decide I'm out, right, I don't want to do this anymore, right, I'm going to go get a pack of cigarettes and never come back kind of situation, it would make it easy for me to do that, right, to kind of abandon my family. Not to say you couldn't abandon a family if you were married, but it makes it more difficult, right? I'm still on the hook for child support, but think about it. If I'm married, now it's a divorce we have to deal with, right? As opposed to if we're not married, then no divorce. Child support still something that that's there regardless of marriage or not. But that's kind of the idea, right? Or alimony, would be also another thing that I have to consider, right? If I was married to somebody, if I wasn't married to them, then really the only thing that might be able to get me for financially would be the child support payment. So the argument is that cohabitating couples are less stable environments for children. Okay. And the argument could be because these people that choose to cohabitate take family less seriously, right? So if you're willing to kind of have a family in this kind of loose or less restrictive way, then how seriously do you actually take family? It is kind of the idea, right? And it's funny because in the past I've had students say things about marriage and family and things like that, and the students that have shared their families' views on this too, right? A lot of it comes from religious background, very conservative background, right? And I've had students say flat out that their parents wouldn't, under no circumstances, be okay with them cohabitating with anybody. And if they were to, it would be a problem, right? Sanctions would be swift, they would be sure, and they would be severe, right? I had one student tell me that they moved in with a boyfriend, and the family warned them that if they did that they would essentially disown them. And that's what happened. The student told me that when they moved out with this person, that the family stopped talking to them, and they had siblings. And at that point, the student was in my class. They said they hadn't spoken to their siblings in 2 years. So 2 years of not talking to their siblings because the family pretty much said, the parents said, you're not allowed to talk to them. So very serious sanctioning, right? Depending on what the background is. And supporters for cohabitation will argue that it's really nobody else's business when it comes down to it, right? I'm not hurting myself. I'm not hurting anybody else. So it should be the concern of the government, right? This is an agreement between two consenting adults, and that should be enough. There shouldn't be anything else, any other intrusion or requirement as far as what the behavior should be or whether it should be allowed. No, it's two adults, up to them, right? And this kind of idea that it meets the needs of a diverse society, right? And this is kind of what I talked about before, as far as like, things being expensive, right, in Orange County. So, making ends meet, right? You partner up with somebody, and that could help. So just strategy for survival, essentially, right? All right, I kind of already talked about this. I should have probably removed this slide, but this idea of the nuclear family model being in decline, it is in decline, but I'd argue not not in a way where it's going to disappear. Maybe that's kind of my issue with this. Maybe that's why I'm having a hard time with it being in the text this way. Like it's declining, but it's still not going anywhere. It's just not. It's there. It's persistent, right? It's always it's always going to be there, right? At least in my opinion, this nuclear family model as like the preference. I mean, I just don't see that not being part of us. Okay. So I covered everything I wanted to cover for this chapter. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Guys, take care. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.